Welcome to the Vandy Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Lee. Our guest today will be New York Dore. We will talk Vanderbilt baseball. This show is sponsored by the Well Coffee House, a Nashville area coffee house that provides fresh roasted coffee along with its house-made pastries, breakfast and lunch offerings. There are 5 locations to serve you in the Nashville area. Those can be found in Brentwood, Green Hills, downtown, Bellevue, and Cool Springs Lifeway. You can get more information at wellcoffeehouse.org. The Well Coffee House, where coffee changes lives. We also thank our co-sponsor, Wellspire, Nashville's Learning and Development Center, which is located in the Gulch. Our news presented by Sutherland & Belk, a family-owned injury law firm. If you or a loved one has been hurt in any type of accident, give Taylor or Russell a call at 615-846-6200 to see what your rights are and if they can help. Vanderbilt sweeps a 3-game baseball series at Alabama. The Commodores improved to 31-9 overall, 12-6 in the SEC, a full game behind Georgia in the overall standings. Vandy now on a 4-game winning streak. Right fielder J.J. Bleday hit 4 home runs and now has 20, which is 2 off the school record of 22 set by Pedro Alvarez in 2007. The Commodores are off until Thursday when they start a 3-game series with Auburn at Hawkins Field. Joining us now, our friend New York Dore. First of all, thank you for joining us. Second of all, great week for Vanderbilt baseball. 3 wins on the road at Alabama, which gives Vanderbilt 3 more conference wins. It would have given Vanderbilt 3 more top 50 RPI wins, but beating Alabama 3 times knocked the Crimson Tide out of the top 50. Either way, you throw in a win against Indiana State, a really good ball club from the Missouri Valley Conference, which has turned out to be a surprisingly good league, and Vanderbilt played a lot of games against it too, by the way. All in all, great week for Vanderbilt baseball, and thank you for being with us today.
It was a fantastic week overall and a really well-played weekend for Vanderbilt. I mean, obviously, with the J.J. Bleday show, which we'll talk about. But, I thought overall the offense really looked good. It was motoring on. You had the return of Pat DeMarco, and he had a really, really solid games on Saturday and Sunday, both offensively and defensively. Sunday, the bats didn't exactly set the world on fire. Actually faced some good pitching relative to what we've seen on some Sundays. This guy, Deacon Metters, who closed out the last 3 innings, really, really impressive. It reminded me a little bit of Hayden Stone with a little bit better of a fastball and a little bit, significantly worse control, but his control was pretty good on Sunday. We also saw him on Friday. Kid's just got a hammer curve. His spin rate must be off the charts and poor recognition. I think Ethan Paul's going to probably, but for the fact that we had, 3 wins over the weekend, Ethan Paul's going to have nightmares about facing that curveball because he was just eaten alive by it. But the offense really, I thought, chugged along well. Relatively good defense all weekend. I mean, Julian had his one little hiccup inning where he had a ball go through the wickets, which somehow was called a hit, should have been an error, and then picked up a ball that may have been rolling foul in that same inning. Otherwise, had a fantastic weekend at first base. Harry Ray did a pretty good job at second. Ethan Paul continues to be fantastic at shortstop. And Austin Martin did have, I think, an error on Saturday, but otherwise played some pretty good third infield. So it was a good weekend all over, I think, for the Vandy boys.
Well, we can't talk about the weekend without getting into J.J. Bleday's performance quickly. Hit 4 bombs over the weekend stretch and then hit, was it 1 or 2 against Illinois State?
1.
Or Indiana State, excuse me. So anyway, 5 home runs for the week. I said this last week in another podcast. He looks like one of these slow-pitch softball players that just sits up there and waits on his pitch, and then once he connects, it's going out. I've never seen anybody, with the exception of maybe Steven Scott's hot streak last year, that's in the groove like he is at Vanderbilt.
And I was thinking about it, and I wanted to go back and check the numbers. I mean, he may actually be beyond where Scott was over the last 14 games. I think it's I've lost track of the numbers. It's something like 12 homers over 14 games or 13 over 15, something like that. And, Scotty hit, I think, 9 over the last 2 or 3 weeks, which would account to basically being on the same level. But it's just remarkable. I mean, everything he's hitting has a launch angle. Now, to be fair, you put him in that ballpark that Alabama has, he's going to hit a lot of home runs, particularly out to left, because the ball really does fly to left field, and it's a bit of a short alley. But that doesn't mean you can't hit a bomb, and Julian proved that, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little. But everything he's hitting right now is just it's just remarkable. And it's not like he's so locked in that he can't be fooled, because he has been striking out a bit, but it's strikeouts that include loud foul balls or strikeouts on pitches where it's an unhittable pitch. If the ball's in the zone, he's just cranking it, and it's really something to see.
Let's talk about the Golden Spikes race for a minute. Is it Rutcschmann and Bleday? I did not see what Vaughn has done over the weekend, but what is the consensus on what's the very short list for who is up for that at this point?
I think absent a change in circumstance, and I would note that, a change in circumstance would include the hot streak that Hunter Bishop at ASU had earlier in the year, probably about a month ago, and the hot streak that Bleday is on now. I mean, to the extent that Bleday continues at this pace, which is virtually impossible to do, even though the air is heating up and the ball's going to start traveling a little bit more, I can't fathom that Bleday at this pace would end the season in the Super Regionals or in Omaha with like 35 home runs. That's not going to happen. That's Chris Bryant kind of crazy, or Gorilla Ball kind of crazy. But if you were looking and you extended out, let's say JJ continues on this streak for another 2 weeks, then he's squarely in the conversation with Rutschmann. And Rutschmann's numbers are just crazy. Andrew Vaughn has, had an outstanding season, but I don't think he competes at this point with Rutschmann. And then Bleday is sort of the next notch down.
Yeah, and I know it seems crazy that somebody could be better than Bleday, but I ran some numbers here. They are. Bleday has hit 363, 462, 796. That is batting average, on base, and slugging. Rutschmann has gone 419, 585, and 812. And I've got this runs created formula that I can adjust for how many runs the team scores, or I can run the raw number. And Bleday has created just over 51 runs in 196 plate appearances. He's made, what was it? He's made, I think, 30 more outs. And Rutschmann has, quote-unquote, created about 52 runs, which is one more, in 169 plate appearances, which is 37 less. In other words, Rutschmann has come to the dish, 37 fewer times. And maybe you account that in, that the more you play, you may lose some production to rust. But if you're creating more runs and a lot fewer plate appearances and you play a more demanding position, and oh, by the way, strength of schedule, according to Boyd's World, Vanderbilt is 16. According to RPI, it's 2. For Oregon State, according to Boyd's World, it's 3. RPI is 4. So debatably tougher schedule, plays a harder defensive position. As great as J.J. Bleday has been, you have to do some mental gymnastics to say that Bleday has been better.
Yeah, I think that's right. And to be frank, you also have a hard time saying, oh, well, Bleday plays in the SEC because, Oregon State plays in the number 2 RPI conference, or I'm sorry, maybe 2 or 3. I'm not sure if the ACC or the Pac-9 Pac-12 is number 2. Pac-9, of course, being North Carolina State, home of the McRib. But, they've played some solid competition, both in the out-of-conference. I mean, they played an out-of-conference series against West Virginia. They had a nice Seattle showcase with teams that ended up not being necessarily having quite as good a season, but Minnesota, Indiana, and Coastal. And then they've gone and they've played at UCLA, which is the number one team. They've played hosted Cal, who's solid. Hosted Washington, okay, that's fine. Utah, okay, starting to make an argument against. But then had to go down and play Arizona State, which is 30-8. And they do have Stanford coming up in a few weeks. They have Oregon in a couple weeks, and they have Oklahoma State coming up in 2 weeks. So they have some tough competition. And I think the other key point is, Adley Rutschmann, he's not coming off 1-1. He's the number one pick in the draft, and the only person who was ever going to catch him was Bobby Witt, and that looks like it's not going to happen. So Adley Rutschmann's number one. You can't ignore the fact that his average and on-base percentage numbers are better than Austin Martin's. I mean, that's just bonkers. And you don't live and die by the home run. I mean, Rutschmann's got how many homers? It's not an impressive total.
13.
But 13. So it actually is an impressive total. It's more than I thought it was. But the OP, the slugging percentage is just so high. He's really, really got a lot more walks. Now, if you go in the strategy of say, a baseball scout from 30 years ago, and you believe run production matters, and you look at the run number and the RBI number, Bleday leads in runs and RBIs. But if you look at it from a sabermetrician perspective, or from a value of position perspective, or from this guy's going to be the 1-1 in the draft, you need a lot of mental gymnastics, as you put it, to get Bleday into serious consideration for winning, as opposed to just on that final panel in Omaha for the final three.
Adley Rutschmann's name just sounds like he should be playing at Vanderbilt.
It does. It does. And the one that doesn't, though, is down at, where is he? Is it Georgia? Has Zebulon Vermillion?
Oh, Arkansas, yes.
Arkansas, yes, which is my favorite name out there right now. I mean, that's right up there with Handsome Monica, who was one of the California teams, I think. But I think both of them made the Name of the Year contest.
And deservedly so. I think Adley Rutschmann might be the grandson of Thurston Howell III, perhaps.
Possibly.
Yeah. We're going to go ahead and put that out there, and that's going to make it so.
Until someone says it's not true, we're just accepting it as true.
If it's said on a podcast, then it's true. Yeah,
just like I said that the last Commodore to wear number 80 before Kumar Rocker was Rip Sewell, the inventor of the ephus
right.
pitch, and no one has refuted that, so I'm going with it.
Isn't that who Sewell Thomas Stadium is named after? Or is that, no, it's Joe Sewell, isn't it?
Yeah. Rip Sewell was a football player at Vanderbilt who played, I think, a season and a half of baseball, went on to pitch for either the Pirates or the Phillies, and was the inventor of the ephus pitch.
I'm going to issue a challenge to Vanderbilt, because I've gone back and looked up. There's a lot of big leaguers from like the teens and the 20s and 30s that it attributes their playing career to Vanderbilt in terms of college, that it's really not a lot's been documented on that. Maybe Bill Trogberg, somebody can do some research, but if you've ever looked up, there's one site, and I can't think of what it is, that if you say MLB players from Vanderbilt, it will pull up a lot of guys in the 20s and 30s. There's some undone work there with some guys with Vanderbilt ties that I just know nothing about.
Yeah, well, and I think you go back in history, that's going to be the case no matter what. And I think it's Baseball Reference. I mean, Baseball Cube is the one which actually covers college stats, which makes it great. But I think it's Baseball Reference that you can actually see all the major leaguers who attended Vanderbilt. Actually, Baseball Reference carries the Vanderbilt players who were drafted post 1971, not all of those who played. So you're right; it's Baseball Almanac who has the everyone who played.
Julian Infante hit a massive home run, but one thing that bothered me, he struck out 9 times this week.
Yeah, and I hear you, Chris. They were not 9 strikeouts where he looked overmatched, though. This was not a return to last year. It was strikeouts where either was a good pitch. It wasn't chasing. It was a lot of two-seam fastballs that got in on him, or just getting flat beat by a good pitch. So yes, he had a less than stellar weekend at the plate, but I wouldn't everyone turn around and say, "Oh no, this is Julian 2018." I think it's Julian 2019 who's looks a little bit more like Julian 2017, which is what we want. You're right that I think people don't really appreciate how good a hitter he was in 2017, where he would just foul off pitchers' pitches and really extend at bats and then punish mistakes. He's not there, but his plate discipline has come back to something akin to that. Whereas last year, if you threw it anywhere near the zone but out of the zone, he would be chasing it. And that's not who he is right now. He got beat in the zone this weekend, oftentimes by good pitches. And, I think he had the misfortune of facing that Metters kid 2 or 3 times and struck out each time. You can say the same about Ethan Paul, who actually looked, again, a lot worse against that kid than Julian did. So I wouldn't really stress about that too much. The ball he hit on Saturday, though, I think everyone's sort of still agape at that, because someone's got to walk it off. That we were saying probably at least 430 feet, possibly well more than that.
Yeah,
He cleared the scoreboard.
Joe Fisher on the broadcast, I was listening to it a little bit on Sunday. If I understood him correctly, I think he said that he had talked to some Alabama people. They thought that might have been the furthest ball ever hit at Sewell Thomas.
It was a moonshot, and the camera guy who was in tight completely lost it, because I don't think it occurred to anyone that someone could hit it over that scoreboard. But he just flat out cleared it. And there was one camera angle which was a little more pulled back, where you could appreciate just what a launch it was. But it was something to see. And again, he had the one inning where he just sort of had a brain fart. But for the most part, he had a splendid weekend defensively at first, made some really nice plays. Made a really nice play with one out in the 9th inning on Sunday, getting up high. He plays taller than 6'3", at first base, and that benefits people like Ethan and Austin and Harry, in that he can scoop, he can tag, he makes plays that others wouldn't make at first. Now it's going to be very interesting when Cooper Davis comes back, and I don't think there's a particular update. I think on the broadcast we heard that it was something to do with his hip. I had assumed it was a hamstring. Hopefully he gets better soon. It's something that's bothered him for a few weeks, but was significantly aggravated, I think, last Saturday. And my understanding was he was not active this past weekend. But when Cooper comes back, how do you make this work? Do you try and get Steven Scott in at second and move Cooper to left? Do you just move Scotty into the DH role and Ty Duvall sits again? Do you platoon Scott and Julian at first in order to get the extra lefty bat in against right-handed pitchers? Do you, it's complex, and I don't know how it goes, but it would seem to me that most likely the odd men out again in the sort of the lineup crunch are going to be Jason Gonzalez, who really hasn't played a whole lot recently, but still has astounding numbers. Something like 350, 530 on base. I don't think those would play long term. I've said again, I think he's a big power bat. He's made huge improvements versus last year, but he's not a 330 hitter in all likelihood. But him, and then again, Ty Duvall, who does nothing but hit line drives. Unfortunately, far too often those line drives end up in the glove of a right fielder just short of the track. But he would seem again to be the odd man out.
Let's talk pitching for a minute. I thought for the most part it was pretty good. Alabama got 15 hits the entire weekend, 1 home run, 1 double, 13 singles. The Crimson Tide had 12 walks and 3 hit batsmen. By the way, Alabama, I think, if I read the graphic correctly, was 7th in the country at taking free passes, or in terms of walks at least, not hit by pitches factored in. But all in all, I don't think that the walk numbers were bad considering who they played, and Alabama did not hit the ball hard in what is a hitter's park. I thought that the 9 runs they scored I thought that the staff pitched better than that number showed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, first off, it was 15 hits, but really it was 13 hits. The scorekeeper at Alabama may be the worst scorekeeper I've seen in the history of watching college baseball, which says something. I mean, he scored the comebacker that Drake whiffed on in the, I want to say, 5th or 6th inning on Friday. He called that a hit, even though, you don't need to be Sonny Gray to field that ball. You could probably be, I'm trying to think who the least athletic pitcher we've had. I'm not going to call anyone out. We'll say we'll move Adam Cronk to the mound. Adam Cronk could have fielded that ball. He called that a hit. That led to 2 runs, which were credited as earned runs against Drake, but really should have been unearned runs. He made the error, so it's his fault. But that was called a hit. And then again, a hard ground ball through Julian's legs, where Julian didn't even have to move. It was just one of those balls where it gets on you quick, goes through your legs, and you sort of drop your head and say, oh, man, I really got an error on that one. And somehow that's a hit. Call it 13 hits. The staff pitched extraordinarily well. Really want to point out, actually, Hugh Fisher on Sunday came in and was, he looked like a major leaguer. Painting the outside corner with heat and then dropping sliders in that made the opposing lefties just cry, basically. To the extent that Major League Baseball doesn't impose a minimum batters of faced rule on relievers to improve speed of game, you can see Hugh Fisher having a long career in the major leagues if he can just throw those 2 pitches. So Hugh looked fantastic. Tyler Brown had a good weekend. It wasn't, one of those unhittable weekends for him, but it was still a very good weekend. I thought Kumar Rocker didn't have his best control, but man, he just looks like he has fun on the mound and is just really, really a joy to watch. And I think gave up, 2 hits in 5 or 6 innings and really was conservative pulling him out because he really maintained his pitch count low. I think he only had something like 60 pitches through the first 5 innings or something like that. That may be shorting it a bit, but it was impressive. It was sub 13 pitches per inning for the first 4 or 5 innings. Drake was good. He wasn't great, but the thing I love about Drake is I think he's one of the most mentally tough pitchers we've had in the Corbin era. And that doesn't mean he's always up for competition like Sonny, where he gets better the bigger the moment, or with Carson, where you saw that sort of competitiveness and toughness. Drake's is a little bit different. Drake is not going to be perfect, but he doesn't get rattled and shaken, which is somewhat of a weird thing to say because for Drake, things tend to snowball. But that Drake's toughness is not always necessarily in the moment that way when he starts to lose it. It's that he can get it back. And we've seen that numerous times over the years where he'll get himself into trouble and then he'll get out of it, or he'll have a bad inning early and then he goes on to have 4 or 5 really, really strong innings. He's just mentally, he can come back from failure really well, and that's something that's really impressive. And then Pat Raby may have been pitching for his weekend spot, to be frank, heading into this weekend. I thought he was good. He was frustratingly good in that he had very good results, but then he would issue a 4-pitch walk or a 5-pitch walk just sort of out of nowhere, and you're like, come on, Pat, You're a kid who can throw the fastball for strikes. Do it. I mean, what's your take on heading into next weekend versus Auburn, knowing that we don't have a midweek game? So if Corbs was going to make a change between the midweek and the weekend, it would potentially be here.
Yeah, I was going to ask you the same. My opinion is I would go ahead and make the switch. I've talked about, I think pitch efficiency is underrated, and it's not like you seal it in stone and say that you can't make the change back. I just think that Mason has pitched better. He's allowed fewer free passes. His base runners per inning pitch are markedly lower. I just think right now he's a better pitcher. He shows more confidence, more command. I think you give it a try, see where it goes, and you're against the easier portion of the schedule right now coming down the stretch, and now is the perfect time to do it.
So here's the counter on that, and I'm going to argue actually the opposite position, is that we've seen Mason in the flex role for probably about half of the last two seasons, where, yeah, he can throw the midweek start, but he can also come in and give you 2, 3, 4 consistent innings and sort of calm a game down. Pat Raby's been a starter his entire career. And yes, he's been frustrating to watch at times, particularly on pitch efficiency, particularly on finishing batters. But this is a guy who has done nothing but win. And if you look at his numbers this year, yes, the whip isn't great, but people don't make hard contact against him. The last 2 weekends have greatly, the prior 2 weekends, not this past weekend, but Arkansas and Georgia have greatly inflated his batting average against. But if you remove those 2 weekends, the kid is still only given up 2 extra base hits outside of those 2 weekends. He has still a 2.94 ERA. And that's inclusive of those 2 weekends. Yes, the whip is way too high. Yes, you have concerns that he can't necessarily go deep into games because he's not being efficient with his pitches. The 6 innings he threw this weekend were the strongest performance he's had in a while as far as getting deep into games without getting the pitch count run up too high. But here's the other component. Pat Raby now sits between 2 pitchers, and that's Sonny Gray and Jeff Peoples. This is a kid who is possibly this weekend going to tie Jeff Peoples for the all-time winningest pitcher in Vanderbilt history. It is a kid who, even at his worst, has done nothing but put his team in a position to win. And yes, a couple of frustrating performances over the prior 2 weeks, but he's a winner, and that should mean something. I mean, this is a kid who, if you look at his career stats, 7-1, 2.61 ERA, 10-4, 2.73 ERA. Yes, 2018 only 5-5, 3.57, but it wasn't. There was some rationale and reason behind it. And then this year, trying to pull up his actual stats right here, 2.94, 6-1. Kid doesn't do anything but win. And, part of me says we're looking to make a change when one's not necessarily needed. And I get that there's no midweek this week, but use Mason for a couple innings, try and give Tyler a little bit more rest over the weekend. And then you've still got him for some of the upcoming important midweeks we've got, including Louisville, which comes up in we've got Tennessee Tech, who, yes, they're having a way down season, but they always seem to have some hitters there. And then we've got Louisville on May 7th. And that's a big game. I mean, Louisville's RPI 6, and it's a road game against them. If we can win at Louisville, as crazy as that might seem, that could be the difference between being a national seed or not, unless we just basically nearly run the table against everyone else, in which case there's no argument to be made. But it's important to get that national seed, and a road game against an RPI 6 is huge.
Well, and here's another thing. They set up really well for the postseason. In fact, you could maybe even argue that they are going to be tougher in the postseason than they are in this current format, and here is why. If you just keep rolling him out there as a starter, then Mason Hickman is your number 4 in a regional if you need him. Mason Hickman is your number 4 in Hoover, which they would if they keep winning. Mason Hickman is a guy that you probably throw in Omaha in a starting role if you keep advancing. Or maybe he is, maybe he's not. It depends on how much you lose. But here's the other thing. Their tournament baseball at the very highest, Hoover and Omaha, they're both pitchers' ballparks. They're both deep dimensions. And by the way, Raby, I don't know what Hickman's breakdown is, but Raby, too, that he factors into this because he is a fly ball pitcher. He will give up some deep fly balls, but they never seem to lead the yard. I just think that the parks and the setup really makes them, as tough as they are to beat now, it makes them even tougher. And oh, by the way, if you get in a bind, you can always scrap that plan and go to Hickman earlier, which they have not used him lately in the break glass in case of emergency on a weekend.
Yeah. And the other person actually I want to chit-chat about, and I can't recall if we did it last week when we talked about guys who you might see as we, and we'll probably need as we get into Hoover and as we get into hopefully Omaha. I think Ethan Smith's been good, not necessarily consistently good, but good. But a couple of guys to keep an eye on is AJ Franklin. Again, looked good in his 2 innings. I can't recall if it was against Indiana State or if it was against Arkansas.
Indiana State.
The big one, Indiana State. He looked really good, and that's a kid who could be useful if he throws strikes, which is sort of what he got away from at the beginning of the year, and sort of put him off radar. But he's a kid who could be important, and the guy I guarantee you he's getting a lot of work in off the side and trying to come back is Jackie Fastball, Jack Gillis. And another kid who has experience, who just hasn't sort of harnessed things yet this year. But there are going to be some options to come around. And, you don't always know who's going to be playing a big role when you get towards the postseason. Corbs has a habit of sort of displaying who's in the circle of trust, but that doesn't mean someone doesn't sort of emerge into that circle somewhat unexpectedly.
Let's go to the mailbag, which is sponsored by Vanderbilt fan Josh Minton, an independent insurance agent operating out of Brentwood. Looking for a one-stop shop to take care of your insurance needs? Josh has you covered. Call him today at 615-933-1979. Email him at josh@hqinsurance.com. Follow him on Twitter at Joshua Minton HQ, on Facebook at facebook.com/JD Minton HQ. He's my insurance agent. Give him a try. Tell him you heard about it here. No risk involved. You cannot lose with this deal. Josh can either help you out or leave you no worse off than you started, and you meet a nice guy to boot. So anyway, give him a try, and I think you'll be happy. Okay, these are a couple of questions from last week that we didn't get around to. VU65 says, why have Gillis and Becker pitched so little before the season? People thought Gillis would be the top closer.
So, I thought Jackie would be end of bullpen arm. I actually had Tyler Brown as closer. And of all things, I thought number 2 in my closer rankings was Justin Willis. So it shows how much I know, because Justin Willis didn't even end up on the roster. Took a red shirt, one which I think everyone regrets, because he's a kid who really could have been in the circle of trust at the end of the season. And if we were going to make one criticism of coaching decisions on this year, it's actually not going to be defensive replacements. It's going to be that red shirt decision. But beyond that, let's take a step back. So Austin Becker threw, I believe, the grand total of 2 intra-squad innings between setting foot on campus and opening day. So this is a kid who lost 6 months or 8 months. So I think we needed to have some expectations. Now, he came in, had his debut where he just was fantastic, and he's a very special talent. So I wouldn't read not contributing this year to not able to be a frontline contributor going forward. It's just a matter of he's 8 months behind everyone else. And even if he's healthy now, that 8 months is something you have to come back and sort of get ready for. And it's tougher to do that during the SEC season than it is during the early preseason, because you're just not facing the same level of competition. You can play, Pepperdine, or, well, probably Pepperdine's not the best example, but you can play, maybe Dayton or ETSU and throw a kid who is working back more easily than you can against a Florida or a Georgia or an Arkansas. Now, Gillis is a little bit of a different story. I think we've talked about it a little bit before. And my understanding is there's no health issues at play. It's just he hasn't had it, and it hasn't clicked thus far this season. Interestingly enough, his draft stock, yes, it's fallen, but it hasn't fallen that much because he's still the same pitcher. It's just it hasn't clicked. It's not the yips. It's not an injury, but he's just not been game ready, I guess is probably the best way of putting it. And it's the type of thing where if you told me Jackie Gillis ends up coming back and being a key piece in the bullpen in a postseason run, I'd say, yeah, I absolutely can believe that. Because I think it really is just sort of a light switch type thing right now for him, where getting back to being super aggressive and trusting his stuff and just letting it fly. And I think that could happen still.
Last question that I've got to get out of here. Baseball Bros says, why is the bullpen so inconsistent? It seems to be loaded with power arms, but some days they can't find the strike zone. Then other days they just can't get anybody out. Is Scott Brown to blame?
I don't think blame is the right word. I think that Scott has responsibility for the pitching staff. Scott has responsibility for roster decisions. Corbs makes the pitching changes, but Scott keeps it all queued up, and he has a role in recruiting. And, really since the end of DJ's term and before he left, I'd put that, Vanderbilt has shifted to being a school that is known for developing and protecting arms that are big league in caliber. But not necessarily big league in stuff. And there's a little bit of selection bias here, that if you're recruiting a kid who has a clearly big league arm, and perhaps the best example of this is maybe Matt McGarry, who flashed brilliance but never could control it with a consistently 94, 95 fastball, a lot of life. Another guy who would sort of fall into this category is Nick Christiani, who had a lot more success than McGarry here at Vanderbilt, and was at times a great pitcher. These are kids where the stuff is so good and so live that if you're recruiting them as an 18-year-old who can really harness it, you're competing with the front half of the draft. I mean, you're if you are an arm like this that is already game ready, then a lot fewer of those kids are going to get through the draft than not. So when you dive into the deep waters of developed kids, and a good example of this was probably Ethan Hankins last year versus Kumar Rocker. So the knock on Kumar, I mean, he was the number one overall pick for about 2 years, number one overall draft prospect for about 2 years. But the knock on Kumar was he couldn't harness it. And with Ethan Hankins, he was a kid who harnessed it. And that's why he went, early enough to go pro, and he got a nice big check with it. Whereas Kumar was, I'm going to go to Vanderbilt, I'm going to have the college experience, and I'm going to harness this. And if we're going to be overly negative about the performance on some from Scott Brown, we also need to recognize the positive. And that includes the development of arms over the years, and that's not just in velocity. If I had my druthers, we'd focus a little less on velocity and a little more on execution. But if you look at the development of pitches getting better, whether that's Drake's slider or what have you, or Tyler Brown's command over the last year. But the guy I look at the most is Kumar. I mean, this is a kid who really is harnessing his stuff, has changed his body, become a lot more than I think most people would have thought a year ago. And he's looking like a steroid. So I think you got to give credit to Scott. And then you also have to understand that, we're waiting in the deep pool when we're talking about the caliber of arms we're recruiting and getting. And you see it play out in the strikeout numbers, the batting average numbers. But part of the trade-off there is if these guys had big league command, they wouldn't be in the college game because they'd have gotten a $3 million check. And that's happened a handful of times. I mean, Vanderbilt's lost a number of really good potential pitchers to the draft, and we're going to see it again this year with Jack Leiter, who's sort of that guy who you expect to have big league stuff, but also the level of command that you would warrant. And it also should be noted that there are a couple of kids in this incoming class who profile more along the lines of command first. I can't remember if it's Mashamer, I'm picking the wrong name. Marshamer was someone who actually.
That was a kid that went to Kentucky.
Yeah, exactly. He who I think it ended up doing pretty well at Kentucky and was their closer last year, if I recall correctly. I don't know if he's still with them this year.
Yeah, he's gone.
He's gone. Okay, but I'd have to go back to our incoming class, and I do want to just give me a moment here. I'll name that person. And I can't find it. Maybe it's Mike. Regardless, it might have been Michael Doolin or Sam Labaki. Both kids who command the zone, and so we'll see a little bit of that in next year's class, along with sort of the big power arms like Spencer Jones and Kendall Williams if they get through. But Jack Leiter's the guy who combines them both, and it's tough to get those kids through. It's going to be tough to get Leiter through, although I continue to feel really good about that. And I think if he does get through, he's a kid who competes for the weekend rotation right away. So long story short, yes, Brown is responsible. He's the person who puts everything on the table for Corbs to make decisions on. He's the one who calls pitches. He's the one who's got to have a feel and know of his staff and impart that to Corbs when he makes his decision on who he's going to trust. But we can't just look at the negative there, and we have to also look at the positive that what's he working with? And it's weird to say that sometimes that can be hard, but when you're working with the highest of the high grade arms, sometimes it's hard to get a kid to school who's going to throw both strikes and 97. And you got to give him some credit. I mean, another kid to take a look at and see impressive improvement is Hugh Fisher this weekend, who really was just lights out yesterday.
Yeah, I want to issue not a rebuttal, but I guess some thoughts on that. I think the expectations, well, first of all, let me start by saying I don't think that the criticisms are completely out of thin air. I look at them and I worry about, okay, why has Zach King not pitched better? Why has Gillis lost his confidence? These are guys that have been in the program now for 3 years, and I think that more often than not, guys should be taking a step forward rather than a step backward. So I do think there's something there. At the same time, where fans set the bar for expectation makes for a very warped discussion at times. And I will give you a couple of examples. I know in Vanderbilt football, a lot of times I see fans on message boards getting really excited, say, "Oh, we're going to be really good this year, and we're better here, here, and here." And I'm like, well, yeah, but you're comparing that to what you've seen for 20 or 30 years. Go take Alabama and Georgia aren't necessarily the best example, but even the middle to upper tier teams in the league, the Auburns, the guys like that, the Floridas, and then put them next to Vanderbilt's players, and that comparison usually doesn't hold up, and you see that happen on the field. Now, to the baseball end, I will see for the last 5 or 6 years people saying in the middle of the year, "Oh, this team is terrible. It won't make a regional, blah, blah, blah." And then postseason begins, and not only are they there, but they make people look silly. The bar of expectations that people set is back at that elite level, 13, 14, 15, 2011. And even then, it's an idealized version. People don't tend to remember the bumps in the road, like the bullpen in 2011 and things like that. And when your bar of expectations is there, you get a flawed view of your team. This is still a really good team. You were comparing them to an idealized version of when they were elite, which, oh, by the way, they're elite again this year. And to take Vanderbilt out of it for a minute, look at Mississippi State, whom a lot of people considered to be maybe the most balanced team in the country. State went to Arkansas this weekend and got shellacked. It gave up 27 runs. I was watching game 2, or maybe it was game 3. I think it was game 2. State, with 1 out in the 7th inning, had walked 13 guys. Sometimes this happens everywhere. And even their worst moments are usually pretty good compared to the worst moments about everywhere else. I think perception is important here too.
Yeah. And, it's baseball. Bad things happen in games from time to time. I think there is valid concerns over, the lack of consistency. But at the same time, these things shake themselves out. And again, I think there is a very real point that, if you're dealing with the high-end arms, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to get a high-end arm through the draft if they are already a proven strike thrower. So you look for development, and yeah, you can criticize this kid. This kid hasn't necessarily gotten better, but then you also look at what we're talking about. I mean, with Zach King, when he loses it tends not to be Zach going Rick Ankiel. It's that he goes up and in on a lefty batter and hits him. And we've seen that a million times with him on 0-2 counts. And sometimes you got to pitch aggressive, and that's part of the thesis. And sometimes it goes wrong. But yeah, I mean, sometimes it's harder to control a big V8 power car than it is to control a Roadster or most certainly a Volvo. And we've got those power arms that are more akin to Fast and Furious than they are to Driving Miss Daisy. And finding the kid who can be both is tough.
Well, I've got to drive my V6 out of here and meet my family for breakfast. They're waiting on me. So with that, I will end the podcast today. New York Dore, thank you so much for joining us. And give out your Twitter account. I know that it comes with a warning, but people, you have some interesting comments during baseball season, and if they want to follow it, where do they do it?
Yeah, that's VU Hawk Talk on Twitter, VU Hawk Talk. And it's I do occasionally. I've tried to calm it down a bit. Occasionally, we'll discuss topics other than sports. If you don't like that, you're welcome not to follow. But I'd also recommend following Chris Mahaffey, who's basically my Vandy Twitter fandom better half. So. If you follow one of us, you tend to get a lot of retweets from the other, and he's actually down in the stands for every game, so he gets a different perspective, whereas I'm generally watching from New York. So I recommend following us both, and he doesn't tweet about politics ever.
Yeah, and yours is at VU Hawk Talk, correct?
Correct.
Okay, he is New York Dore. I'm Chris Lee, the host of the Vandy Sports Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and we will be back with more episodes later in the week.